The candle flickers weakly in the damp air of the cellar, its flame bending each time a draft sneaks through the cracks of the boarded-up window. I clutch a small notebook in my hands, the one my mother gave me long ago, its cover already frayed at the edges, pages yellowed with age. It is my only treasure, my only witness. I am 15 years old. At least that is what my mother insists I still am. But the war has taken that away from me. I am only 15, I whisper to myself, yet this firestorm has already turned me into someone who carries a weapon. Above me, Warsaw groans under the weight of occupation. The streets are patrolled by German boots that echo like hammers striking stone. Hunger gnaws at every family. People vanish overnight, dragged away to prisons, or worse. Children no older than me scavenge for bread in the rubble. Fear has become the language of our city. Tomorrow everything may change. Tonight I write before the uprising begins. I was born in the narrow streets of Warsaw, in a neighborhood where every brick seemed to carry the weight of struggle. My father had once been a school teacher, proud of his books and the way he could shape young minds. But the Germans came, closed the schools, and sent him away for forced labor. We have not heard from him in years. My mother, left behind, became both parent and provider. She works as a seamstress, mending torn coats for neighbors, her fingers raw from the needle. Every coin she earns goes to keep me alive. I used to dream of classrooms and chalkboards of afternoons spent running through fields just outside the city. Those dreams ended the day the soldiers marched in, shouting orders in a language I did not understand, pointing rifles at old men and children alike. Now the soundtrack of my youth is the rumble of tanks and the sudden silence after a gunshot. Still, my mother tried to protect me from it all. Each night she would whisper, "You are only a boy. Promise me you will stay safe." Her voice carried both love and despair, as if she already knew that promises were fragile things in times like these. I wanted to obey her. I wanted to remain her son, not a soldier. But every day I walked past walls covered with posters, threats, and propaganda, and every day I saw neighbors humiliated, beaten, or worse. How could I stay a child when the city itself demanded that I grow old before my time? It began with whispers passed from one boy to another in the alleyways and courtyards of Warsaw. Whispers of the Armia Krajowa, the home army fighting in the shadows. At first they sounded like fairy tales, heroes striking back, sabotaging trains, smuggling weapons under the noses of the Germans. I wanted to believe they were real because hope was rarer than bread. Then I saw it with my own eyes. A neighbor barely older than me slipped out at night with a pistol hidden under his coat. Days later, he did not return. His mother's cries echoed through the walls, but even her grief carried pride. "He died for Poland," she said, as though those words were armor against despair. Something inside me shifted. I was tired of being only a witness, tired of watching men in black uniforms drag families into the street, tired of seeing hungry children pick crumbs from the gutter. I wanted to fight back even if my hands still trembled when I imagined pulling a trigger. My friends felt the same. We shared stolen newspapers, secret leaflets, stories of victory, small fragile sparks in the darkness. Some became couriers racing through ruined streets with messages hidden in their shoes. Others carried grenades, clumsily but bravely. My mother begged me not to join them. "You are all I have left," she pleaded. But each time I saw her shoulders stoop lower under the weight of survival, I knew I could not stand aside. I wanted to protect her, protect Warsaw, protect the memory of the father who might never come home. And so at 15, I made my choice. I would join the resistance. By the summer of 1944, the city seemed to hold its breath. Rumors spread faster than the smoke that rose from bombed-out houses. They said the Red Army was approaching from the east, that soon the Germans would be forced to retreat. For the first time in years, people spoke openly of freedom as if the very air of Warsaw had begun to crackle with possibility. But hope was dangerous. The Germans tightened their grip. Patrols grew harsher, punishments more brutal. Entire families were dragged from their homes if even a scrap of resistance material was found. Posters screamed threats in bold letters. Starvation haunted us like a second occupier. Every crust of bread was a prize, every sip of milk a miracle. Still beneath the surface, preparation stirred. Weapons hidden in cellars, maps spread out under candlelight, passwords whispered at midnight. The city's young men and women were no longer waiting. They were sharpening knives, filling bottles with fuel, practicing signals. Even boys like me were told, "You will carry messages. You will be our eyes and ears." At home, the tension grew unbearable. My mother tried to shield me, pretending life was still ordinary, but the look in her eyes betrayed her. She knew the storm was coming. She feared it would take me with it. On the streets, people carried themselves differently, half terrified, half determined. Warsaw was a city wounded, starved, and beaten, yet ready to rise once more. I could feel it in my bones. The uprising was no longer a dream, it was a countdown. As I close my notebook and snuff out the candle, a shiver runs through me, not from the cold, but from fear. Tomorrow, I will meet the others in the resistance cell. I will carry my first messages, dodge German patrols, and step into a city ready to erupt. I know I am still a boy, and yet I feel the weight of a soldier pressing down on my shoulders. Every choice now carries consequences I cannot fully understand. Will I survive the first firefight? Will I see my mother again? Will Warsaw stand or crumble beneath the boots of the occupiers? I try to summon courage, but my hands tremble as I write these words. Still, there is a stubborn spark in me that refuses to be extinguished. Even if I fail, even if I am scared, I must try. The night is quiet, almost mocking in its stillness. Tomorrow the uprising begins, and with it my childhood ends. The cellar smelled of damp earth and smoke, a permanent reminder that we were hiding from the eyes of the occupiers. I stepped inside, heart hammering, and saw them for the first time, men and women older than I could imagine, scarred by life and war, yet moving with a quiet authority. They turned to look at me, and I felt every eye weigh me down. I was only 15. Then I saw the weapons. A rifle leaned against the wall, its metal cold and heavy in the dim candlelight. Lying nearby were lanyards of grenades and a knife with a leather sheath. My fingers trembled just brushing them. For months I had imagined what it would feel like to hold a weapon, but now holding a real rifle, my imagination faltered under the weight of reality. The training was crude but urgent. I learned to move silently through the rubble, to use hand signals in the darkness to stay crouched and avoid patrols. The older fighters laughed at my awkwardness. "You're a child, but you'll learn," one said with a grin. Another clapped my shoulder, rough and reassuring. I wanted to prove myself, though. My stomach quivered every time I imagined the rifle going off in my hands. Before I left, I scribbled a note for my mother. "I will try to be brave," I wrote, "though I am scared. Please do not worry too much. I will return." Folding the paper, I pressed it to my chest. Even in fear, I felt a stubborn spark, something that told me I had to step into this darkness to become more than the boy I once was. The night outside was heavy with silence, yet I could feel the pulse of Warsaw under occupation, and I knew tomorrow my childhood would be left behind in the shadows of these streets. The city outside the cellar was a different world at night. Rubble lined the streets like jagged teeth, and shadows seemed to shift with every flicker of a distant flare. I gripped the small satchel strapped across my shoulder, the letters inside heavy with the hopes and secrets of the home army. My hands still shook from holding the rifle earlier, and I tried to steady my breath. "Stay close to the walls," one of the older boys whispered. "Watch for patrols. Never run unless you must. And remember your signals." His voice was calm, but I could feel the tension radiating from him. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Every step was measured, each corner a potential trap. From behind a collapsed doorway, I glimpsed German soldiers moving in formation, their boots hammering the pavement. My heart leapt into my throat. I pressed myself against the bricks, waiting, counting breaths. Then, when they passed, I sprinted silently to the next alley, clutching the letters like a lifeline. I saw the first signs of resistance, small groups darting across the streets carrying bottles and rifles, communicating with hand gestures. For a moment, I felt part of something larger than myself. But the reality of danger was never far. A woman screamed in the distance, and the echo of gunfire made me flinch. Through the night, I delivered each message, slipping past guards and debris, heartsick but determined. The adrenaline kept me moving, yet each encounter left a shadow on my young soul. I thought of my mother and tried to imagine her smile, a beacon in the chaos. By the time I returned to the cellar, dawn was painting Warsaw in muted golden ash. Exhausted, dirty, and trembling, I realized I had survived my first mission. But the city whispered to me that survival was only the beginning, and that every step I took would carry both courage and fear in equal measure. The first days of the uprising were a blur of fear, confusion, and fleeting moments of exhilaration. Every street corner, every shattered building seemed alive with danger. I ran messages from one safe house to another, each time threading my way through rubble and smoke, listening to the staccato echoes of distant gunfire. The city I had known since birth had become a battlefield overnight. I remember the first time I saw a body. A boy, not much older than myself, lay crumpled against a wall, blood dark on the cobblestones. I could not look away. One of the older fighters gently guided me past murmuring Warsaw will teach you lessons that no school ever could. His words burned into me an uneasy mix of understanding and horror. We witnessed skirmishes almost every day. German soldiers patrolled aggressively, and small pockets of resistance tried to hold strategic streets. I ducked behind overturned carts, tossed myself into alleyways, and clutched the rifle that had become an extension of my trembling hands. The air smelled of smoke, gunpowder, and something else, fear pervasive and suffocating. I also learned the strange camaraderie of the streets. Civilians whispered warnings from behind shattered windows. A group of children no older than I shared bits of bread or led me around patrols. I began to feel that even in chaos, Warsaw was a city that protected its own in whatever way it could. Yet the nights were the hardest. I would curl up in abandoned basements listening to the city groan under shell fire. I thought of my mother and tried to imagine her sewing at her tiny table, hoping against hope that I would return. Sleep came fitfully punctuated by the distant screams and the relentless pounding of boots above. By the end of the first week, I had changed. My hands no longer shook as much when I fired the rifle. My eyes had adjusted to the shadows of ruined streets. But inside, I was still 15, still a boy longing for a life that no longer existed. Warsaw had taken my childhood, leaving me only the fight. Being the youngest in the resistance unit was both a burden and a shield. The older fighters watched over me, teasing me one moment and instructing me the next. I remember one night after narrowly escaping a German patrol, an older boy clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You're small, but your heart is bigger than most men's." I smiled, though inside, fear still gripped me. We shared what little food we could find, huddled together in basements and cellars. In those moments, age and rank disappeared. Stories were exchanged of families lost, of narrow escapes, of moments when courage had made the difference between life and death. I began to understand that being part of this group meant trusting them with not only my life, but my very identity. The civilians were another lesson in loyalty and sacrifice. People would hide us from patrols, whisper warnings about German movements, and sometimes silently slip us bread or water. I saw mothers guiding their children away from streets under fire, neighbors risking their lives to ensure we could continue our missions. Each act of courage reminded me that Warsaw itself was alive, a community bound together by survival and defiance. Through these days, I began to feel a strange sense of belonging. Though I missed home terribly, I realized that in the shattered streets and ruined buildings, I had found a family one forged in fear, trust, and shared purpose. We were bound not by blood, but by the city itself, by the uprising, and by the unwavering hope that our small acts could someday turn the tide of history. Even as I moved through the streets with my comrades, a quiet ache never left me. Every shattered window, every collapsed roof reminded me of the home I once knew, of the small apartment where my mother worked tirelessly to keep us alive. I missed the smell of her cooking, the softness of her voice, the way she tucked my little brother in at night. At times, the loneliness became unbearable. The nights were long and the cellars cold, my small body shivering under a threadbare blanket. I wrote letters to my mother, pouring out my fears and longing, though I knew most of them would never leave the cellar. I tried to imagine her reading them, perhaps finding comfort that I was alive, but the words felt thin against the enormity of the war. There were moments of doubt. Why had I left? Why was I here risking death in streets filled with rubble when I could have stayed hidden safe with my family? Yet each time I witnessed cruelty, the Germans dragging neighbors from their homes, children crying for bread, knew I could not turn away. My small hands might tremble, my heart might race, but I had chosen this path. And so I carried on walking the line between fear and courage, haunted by memory, yet driven by duty. Every letter I wrote, every step I took through Warsaw's ruined streets was both a rebellion and a prayer, a hope that someday, somehow, I would return home. By the end of the first week, Warsaw felt like a living trap. Every corner, every alley seemed to hide threats waiting to strike. I had seen too many faces frozen in fear or pain, too many homes reduced to rubble. Even the bravest fighters moved with a tense caution that made the city feel like a wound that could reopen at any moment. Then came the first taste of real tragedy. A boy my age, a fellow courier, was struck by a bullet as he dashed across a street to deliver a message. I watched him fall helpless, the letters spilling from his satchel. The older fighters tried to console me, their voices thick with grief and urgency. Warsaw does not forgive mistakes, one whispered. I felt a chill run down my spine, realizing that every step I took could lead to the same fate. Still, the uprising pressed forward. I carried messages, observed skirmishes, and helped wherever I could. Each encounter with danger sharpened my senses, yet weighed heavily on my mind. The city, once a familiar place of home and laughter, had become a battlefield where every choice could mean life or death. I began to understand that survival was not guaranteed. Each mission was a test of courage, cunning, and endurance. And though fear pulsed through me constantly, I could feel the first stirrings of resolve, the understanding that I had to be brave not only for myself, but for Warsaw, for my mother, and for the boy who had fallen before me. The streets whispered a warning. The war was only beginning, and my childhood had already ended. Tomorrow would demand more than courage. It would demand everything. The morning air was thick with smoke and dust, turning the streets of Warsaw into a gray, suffocating maze. I gripped my rifle tightly, feeling its weight press against my small shoulder. My hands trembled despite the adrenaline coursing through me. Today, I would participate in my first real battle facing German soldiers in one of the city's strategic streets. We moved cautiously through rubble-strewn alleys, every step echoing against the broken walls. Flashes of fire and the sharp reports of rifles punctuated the chaos. Explosions shook the building, sending clouds of brick dust into our eyes. Civilians huddled behind barricades, some clutching children, their faces pale with fear. I caught sight of an elderly man frozen mid-step, staring at us as if he had forgotten to breathe. "Stay low, aim carefully, and move only when I signal," whispered one of the older fighters beside me, his hand briefly resting on my shoulder. "You'll be all right. Remember what we practiced." I nodded, trying to steady my racing heart. The first shot came too close. My fingers found the trigger, and I fired the recoil, jolting me backward. The sound echoed in my ears, and for a moment, I felt the weight of what I was doing, the reality of killing even from a distance sinking into my chest. A boy, no older than me, part of another unit, fell suddenly across the street, a red stain blooming across his uniform. I froze, unable to move or speak. One of the older fighters pulled me behind cover, whispering, "Warsaw will not forgive hesitation, but remember, courage comes in moments like this." The words barely reached me over the pounding of my own pulse. Minutes, hours I could not tell, passed in a blur of smoke shouts and gunfire. Each time I fired, I felt the boy's image flash in my mind, mingling with the faces of civilians scrambling to survive. By the time we withdrew to a safer corner of the street, I was shaking not from cold but from the raw, unfiltered terror and sorrow that the battle had carved into me. Warsaw was alive with death, and I had taken my first step into its fury. Nothing would be the same again. The days that followed the first battle were heavy with grief. I had thought that fear was the hardest part of fighting, but it was nothing compared to the hollow ache of losing someone you had come to trust with your life. One of the older fighters, Janik, had been a guide during my first missions. He was sharp, protective, and always managed to make me smile, even when the city around us burned. Now he lay across the street, struck by a sniper's bullet, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. I couldn't move at first. The letters and notes we had carried together, the whispered jokes in darkened basements, they all felt meaningless now. Another boy, only a year older than me, had tried to save a civilian caught in crossfire. I watched him fall. I wanted to scream, to run, but I knew that standing still or panicking would get me killed as well. We worked quickly to drag the wounded into basements and hidden cellars. Civilians helped where they could, carrying blankets, bandages, even food. I wrapped Janik's arm with torn cloth, my hands shaking as blood soaked through. He whispered something, a faint joke, before he went silent. The older fighters told me to keep moving, that there was no time to linger. But I couldn't shake the image from my mind, the fragility of life in a city turned battlefield. That night, in the quiet of a ruined apartment, I wrote in my diary, trying to capture the faces of those we had lost. I questioned my courage, wondering if I was truly strong enough to survive and continue. Yet somewhere deep inside, a stubborn spark told me that we had to fight on, if only to honor those who had fallen. Warsaw demanded it, and somehow I had to find the strength to obey. The uprising had taught me quickly in war. The cost of attachment is high, and every victory carries the shadow of loss. I was no longer just a boy. I was a witness to death, a keeper of memories, and a reluctant soldier in a city that refused to surrender. It was during a small skirmish along a narrow street that I first felt the sting of war on my own body. A shell exploded nearby, hurling debris and dust into the air. I was thrown against a wall, my shoulder scraped raw by jagged bricks. Pain shot through me sharp and immediate, but it was the fear that clung to my chest that truly shook me. For the first time, I realized that I was not invincible. I pressed a bloodied hand to my shoulder, trying to steady my racing heart. Around me, the chaos continued, shouts, gunfire, and the distant roar of artillery. One of the older fighters grabbed my arm, dragging me into cover behind a collapsed storefront. "You're okay," he said, though. His eyes betrayed his own tension. "Breathe. Focus. Remember why you're here." In the corner of that ruined building, I felt the full weight of terror. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every sound could be the last I would ever hear. I closed my eyes for a moment, imagining my mother's face, the safety of our small home, and the life I had left behind. But I could not stay there. Warsaw demanded movement, action, survival. The wound on my shoulder throbbed, a constant reminder of mortality, but it also forced me to confront my own limits. Each step I took after that, every corner I turned, carried with it the knowledge that fear could not paralyze me. It could only make me aware, alert, alive. That night, when I finally rested in a shadow cellar, I wrote about my injury and my fear. I wrote about how close I had come to never seeing another sunrise. And I wrote about the strange determination that had begun to grow inside me, an understanding that courage was not the absence of fear, but the will to move forward despite it. Warsaw was no longer a city of my childhood dreams. It was a crucible, and I was being forged in its fires. The city had become a graveyard of shattered dreams. Each street we entered carried the weight of horror and despair. One day, as I moved with my unit through a neighborhood still smoldering from a recent bombardment, I saw the aftermath of destruction that no child should witness. Buildings had collapsed like giant toys, doors hanging off, hinges, windows shattered. Smoke curled into the sky, mingling with the acrid stench of gunpowder and burning wood. I passed a family trapped in the remains of their home. The mother clutched a small child to her chest, eyes wide with terror, while her older daughter tried to dig them out. I wanted to help, but my hands shook too violently to lift a single beam. One of the older fighters grabbed me by the shoulder, urging me onward. "There's nothing we can do for them now," he said, his voice strained with sorrow. "We have to keep moving for the others who still can be saved." We encountered more civilians fleeing, the chaos faces streaked with soot and tears. Some carried possessions, photos, letters, scraps of clothing, anything they could hold on to in a world gone mad. Others stumbled too weak or too terrified to continue, and I had to step over bodies in order to complete my missions. At night, the streets were eerily silent, save for the occasional crack of gunfire or the distant hum of artillery. I would crouch in darkened corners, shivering from cold and exhaustion, listening to the moans of the wounded and the whispers of those who had survived. The city itself seemed to mourn, a living, breathing witness to the suffering within its walls. Every step etched images into my memory that I could never erase: the faces of those who would never see another day, the smoke rising from homes, the relentless roar of destruction. I was learning that courage alone was not enough. Survival demanded resilience, composure, and an acceptance of the brutal truths of war. Warsaw was teaching me in the harshest way possible that life and death were intertwined in ways I had never imagined. Every moment of fear, every act of courage, every loss became part of the person I was being forced to become. I had imagined war as something heroic, a story of bravery and triumph, but the streets of Warsaw were teaching me otherwise. Every day I saw death and suffering that no tale could prepare me for. The boy who had fallen during my first mission, the civilians crushed under rubble, the mothers crying for their children, all of it pressed heavily on my mind. Sitting in the shadowed cellar at night, I would write in my diary, trying to make sense of it all. Is this what courage really means? I asked myself. I had thought courage was about holding a rifle facing the enemy. Now I understood it was about enduring, about moving forward, even when your hands shake and your heart screams to run. I began to question the stories adults had told me about glory and honor. War was not a poem, it was a nightmare that swallowed innocence and replaced it with fear and sorrow. Yet I also saw the small, defiant sparks of humanity, civilians sharing bread, fighters risking themselves to save the wounded children like me who refused to hide. These moments reminded me why we fought, even if victory seemed impossible. Sometimes I would imagine my life had continued in the quiet I had lost. School, laughter, family, dinners. The contrast between that world and the one I now inhabited was sharp and cruel. But each night as I laid my head down, I would steel myself for the next day, reminding myself that my actions, however small, mattered. I was learning that war shapes the soul, not just the body. It forces choices I never wanted to make and teaches lessons I wish I could unlearn. Still amidst the horror, I began to find clarity, a stubborn understanding that survival, resilience, and compassion were the only truths I could hold on to. Warsaw was changing me, carving away the boy I had been leaving a witness to suffering a recorder of memories and a reluctant participant in a war far older than I could comprehend. Warsaw had become a city of shadows and echoes. Every street, every corner carried the residue of violence and fear. The air was thick with smoke that rose from smoldering buildings, curling like dark fingers into the sky. Ash and dust coated everything, the cobblestones, our clothes, even our hair. Sometimes it seemed as though the city itself was choking under the weight of its wounds. Gunfire cracked, constantly sharp and unpredictable. The staccato rhythm of rifles mingled with the low rumble of artillery in the distance. Occasionally, a shell would explode nearby, shaking the ground beneath us and sending shards of brick and wood into the air. I learned to flinch before the sound, to anticipate the danger, yet the unpredictability kept my senses taut and my pulse racing. Smells were equally vivid and terrifying. The acrid bite of gunpowder clung to my lungs. Charred wood dust and the coppery tang of blood hovered around every battlefield. The cries of the wounded and the whispers of the frightened civilians formed a constant haunting backdrop. Even in moments of relative calm, the city seemed alive with the suffering it had endured. At night, the darkness brought its own terror. Shadows became enemies, and every alley could hide a soldier ready to strike. Yet in that same darkness, faint candlelight from hidden windows reminded us of life persevering amidst destruction. Fires burned in some corners, lighting up faces twisted in fear or determination, and the distant hum of whispered plans kept hope alive. Through it all, I felt the city pressing upon me, walls scarred with bullets, buildings gaping open like wounds, streets lined with debris that forced us to move carefully. Warsaw was more than a battlefield. It was a living, breathing entity, teaching its children lessons in vigilance, courage, and endurance. Every sensory detail, the sights, the sounds, the smells, etched itself into my memory. It was impossible to forget. Each step I took, each mission I undertook reminded me that this city was no longer the home I had known. It was a crucible, and I was being forged in its fires. The day came when the war pressed upon me more intimately than ever before. We had been ordered to hold a critical street, a lifeline for supplies and communication. The Germans advanced with precision, their rifles cutting through the smoke like sharpened knives. I crouched behind a crumbling wall, my small hands gripping my rifle, every nerve on fire. A sudden explosion threw me against the pavement. Dust and debris blinded me for a moment, and when I lifted my head, I saw Tomasz, a boy my age who had become a close companion, lying motionless. Blood pooled around him, and I froze, unable to comprehend the suddenness of it. One of the older fighters pulled me back into cover, whispering urgently, "We have no time to mourn now. We survived for the city, for each other." But the image of Tomasz's face would haunt me forever. The street became a maze of smoke, fire, and gunfire. Each step I took was a battle with fear itself. I ducked and crawled, delivering messages, checking barricades, helping the wounded. The city screamed around me, and I realized that survival demanded not only courage, but clarity, quick thinking, and an acceptance that friends and allies could fall at any moment. By evening, the street was ours for the moment, but at a terrible cost. The loss of Tomasz and other comrades weighed heavily on me. I understood that the war was not a series of heroic victories, but a crucible of endurance, grief, and moral choices that no child should bear. As I sank into the shadowed cellar that night, bleeding slightly and exhausted, I wrote in my diary. I tried to capture the horror, the fleeting triumph, and the unspoken responsibility that now rested on my shoulders. I was no longer just a boy from a quiet neighborhood. I was a participant in a war that demanded everything from me, my courage, my heart, and my soul. Warsaw had changed me completely. The uprising was only beginning, and I sensed that the days ahead would test me further, forcing me to confront even deeper fears and impossible decisions. The turning point had arrived. I was no longer a spectator. I was a soldier bound irrevocably to the fate of the city. The days after the fighting felt heavier than the battle itself. Warsaw looked less like a city and more like a broken carcass, its bones jutting into the sky. Streets where I had once carried messages now lay buried under rubble. The smell of smoke never left the air, clinging to our hair, our skin, our very breath. Our numbers dwindled with every sunrise. Some comrades were taken by the Germans, their fate sealed in silence. Others bled out in basements that pretended to be hospitals where bandages were rags and morphine was only a memory. A few simply vanished, swallowed by the chaos of collapsing buildings and shifting front lines. Each absence carved a hollow place inside me. I carried my own wound, nothing fatal, but enough to remind me with every movement that I was fragile, human breakable. Sleep offered no relief. I would wake to the echo of artillery, the shaking ground, the cries of children searching for their parents. Even silence felt cruel. In those rare moments when the guns paused, the city groaned under its own destruction. I could hear the weeping of women, the whispered prayers of the old, the muffled sobs of soldiers who had lost too much. Yet we continued. Each day we rebuilt barricades, delivered messages, scavenged for food. There was no time to grieve properly, no place to rest. Warsaw demanded more from us than we thought we had to give. I found myself walking through the ruins like a ghost, half a boy, half a soldier, my spirit stretched thin but unbroken. I told myself again and again, as long as I could still walk, still breathe, still fight, I had to go on. For my mother. For those who no longer could. For Warsaw. The wounded filled every corner of our makeshift shelters. Basements became hospitals. Cellars became wards of pain. The air was thick with the stench of blood, damp stone, and smoke from the streets above. I had thought my shoulder wound was severe until I saw others, men with missing limbs, children with shrapnel embedded in their skin, women burned by fire and shell. Their cries carved themselves into my memory, a chorus of agony that never stopped. We had so little to offer them. Bandages were torn, strips of clothing, disinfectant, a luxury we barely remembered. The few medics and nurses who remained worked until their hands shook and their eyes dulled. Sometimes they whispered prayers over the dying because prayers were all they had left to give. I tried to help fetching water, holding down the arms of fighters as their wounds were stitched without anesthetic, listening to final words spoken in broken whispers. One boy, no older than 16, clutched my hand as life slipped from his eyes. He asked me to tell his mother he had died bravely. I nodded, though I knew I might never find her. His grip loosened, and suddenly I was holding not a friend, but a memory. I began to write down the names of those I could, scribbling them into my notebook so they would not vanish entirely. I feared that if I didn't, the world would forget them as quickly as the rubble swallowed their bodies. At 15, I had become a witness to more death than I could ever describe. The weight of it pressed on me heavier than the rifle slung across my back. Yet, even under that burden, I told myself if I could carry these memories, I could keep them alive in a city that was determined to erase us all. Not long after, our commander gathered us in the corner of a shattered church. His face was gaunt, eyes shadowed by exhaustion, but his voice carried the weight of command. "We cannot hold this sector," he said, pointing at a crude map drawn on scraps of paper. "We withdraw before we are cut off completely. But someone must carry word to the others across the river." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery. I felt his eyes on me and my stomach tightened. "You're small," he said, quietly quick, "and you know the streets better than most. You can slip through where others cannot." He didn't say the rest, that if I failed, the chain of communication might collapse. Inside me, two voices battled. One screamed to stay, to fight alongside the others, to prove I was more than just a boy. The other whispered of my mother, of the promise I had made to return, of the fear of dying nameless in a ruined street. My heart pounded so hard, I thought they could hear it. Finally, I nodded. My throat was too dry to speak, but my gesture sealed the choice. The commander placed a folded message in my hand, his expression both stern and sorrowful. "Do not stop. Do not turn back. This is bigger than you, bigger than all of us." That night, as I prepared to leave, I wrote another note to my mother in the margins of my diary. "I don't know if I will come back, but I will try. If I fall, let it be known that I carried Warsaw in my heart." I tucked the note away, shouldered my satchel, and stepped into the darkness. The night I set out on my mission, Warsaw felt like a labyrinth of fire and shadows. Buildings smoldered their windows, glowing like the eyes of ghosts. The message pressed against my chest inside the satchel, heavier than any weapon I had ever carried. My orders were simple: deliver it across the city to another unit. But every step felt like walking along the edge of death. I kept close to the walls, slipping through alleyways where the rubble formed jagged barricades. German patrols moved methodically, their boots pounding the cobblestones in rhythm. Twice I froze in the darkness as beams of light swept past so close I could hear the creak of leather straps and the clink of rifles. My breath caught in my throat and I prayed they would not hear my heart racing. At one point, I stumbled upon a collapsed building where civilians huddled in silence. A mother cradled her baby, trying to keep it quiet. Her eyes met mine for a brief moment, fear, sorrow, and hope all mingled together. I wanted to stop to help, but the message in my satchel burned like a command, keep moving. Crossing an open street was the worst. The ruins offered no cover, and the night sky glowed red from burning rooftops. I sprinted, my legs weak but desperate as gunfire cracked behind me. Somehow, I reached the far side and ducked into another alley lungs, burning vision, swimming. When I finally arrived at the rendezvous point, the fighters greeted me with weary relief. I handed over the folded message, my hands still trembling. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe I had done something important, that my small frame, my frightened steps had carried hope across a dying city. When I found a rare moment of stillness, I opened my notebook and stared at the pages, wondering who I had become. Only weeks ago, I had been a boy chasing scraps of laughter in the ruins, dreaming of school and afternoons free of fear. Now my hands were calloused from carrying rifles and bandages, my eyes shadowed by sights no child should ever witness. I was no longer the same boy my mother had kissed goodbye. My reflection in shattered glass showed someone older, harder, though still wrapped in the fragile frame of 15 years. I had learned how to run with death at my heels, how to push forward when fear tried to paralyze me, how to bury grief deep enough to keep moving. Yet it wasn't only war's cruelty that changed me. I had seen acts of quiet bravery, neighbors sharing their last crust of bread, fighters risking themselves to save the wounded children, guiding couriers through back streets. These glimpses of humanity were lanterns in the dark, teaching me that resistance was not just about guns or barricades, but about holding on to dignity when everything else was stripped away. In my diary, I wrote, "The war has stolen my childhood, but it has also given me something unshakable, the will to remember, to endure, to speak for those who no longer can." I knew then that survival was not just for myself. If I lived, I would carry the memory of Warsaw, of its screams and its courage, so the world could never claim ignorance. I was no longer just a boy. I had become a witness bound forever to the uprising that had carved me into who I was becoming. The night of the great bombardment is etched into my memory like fire on stone. Our shelter, a half-collapsed townhouse where fighters and civilians huddled together, was struck without warning. The blast tore through walls and ceilings, filling the air with dust, splinters, and screams. In the chaos, I scrambled through rubble, my ears ringing, my lungs choking on smoke. When the dust settled, I saw the devastation. Comrades I had shared bread and laughter with lay pinned beneath beams, their cries muffled by stone and fire. I reached out to help, but the commander's voice cut through the haze. The message, "Save it. If the line breaks, all of this is for nothing." His words pierced me more sharply than the explosion itself. My heart raged. Every instinct screamed to stay, to drag my friends from the ruins, to hold their hands as they faded. But the satchel against my chest burned like a brand, reminding me of my duty. Trembling, tears streaking my soot-stained face, I turned away. Each step felt like betrayal, like tearing myself in two. I ran through the burning streets, clutching the message, my sobs drowned by artillery. Behind me, the townhouse collapsed, fully burying voices I would never hear again. Ahead of me lay only more fire, more darkness, and the unbearable weight of survival. That night, I understood Warforce's choices no one should ever face. To live, I had to abandon what I loved. To honor Warsaw, I had to carry its memory, even if it meant carrying guilt forever. In my diary, I wrote with shaking hands, "I did not save them, but I will remember them. If I survive, their names will not vanish." It was the cruelest lesson of the uprising. Sometimes survival itself is an act of sacrifice. The final days of the uprising bled together into one long nightmare. Our strength was gone, bodies worn thin from hunger spirits, ground down by endless defeat. The cellars that had once been our safe havens were now filled with the groans of the wounded men and women lying side by side on bare stone floors, their breaths shallow, their eyes already halfway gone. There was no medicine left, no bandages, no food to offer them. Only silence broken by the sound of suffering. Outside, Warsaw had become a corpse. Buildings stood like skeletons, blackened and hollow. The streets were littered with ash and the gaunt faces of civilians who staggered through the ruins searching for scraps of bread or a sip of water. Children cried weakly, too exhausted to shed tears. Even the bravest fighters could no longer hide their despair. We were surrounded on every side. The Germans pressed in, relentlessly block by block, closing the city around us like a tightening fist. We knew there would be no rescue, no miracle. The Red Army loomed across the river but never came. Each passing hour deepened the realization that Warsaw would not rise, not this time. I felt my body giving out my wound, aching my stomach, hollow my heart heavy with grief. Still, I clung to my notebook, forcing myself to write. I wanted the world to know what it felt like to stand here at the end. We did not hear the gunfire of victory. We only heard the city itself, broken and breathless, whispering in its ruins. We heard Warsaw dying. When the order finally came to surrender, I could scarcely believe it. We had fought until our bodies were shells, until the city itself had no strength left to give. I remember standing among a line of ragged fighters, weapons lowered, our uniforms torn and stained. We were not warriors anymore, we were shadows clinging to life. I was taken with the others, herded into the open like cattle. German soldiers marched us past the ruins of our own barricades, past the smoldering remains of homes we had once sworn to defend. Some cursed us, some jeered, but most looked on with cold indifference. I kept my head down, clutching my satchel with its crumpled notebook pressed inside, praying they would not notice the trembling of my hands. In the chaos of transport, I slipped away. Perhaps they overlooked me because I was small, or perhaps fate took pity. I found myself in the company of civilians, starving, broken, but alive. Together we stumbled through the ruins, searching for shelter in a city that no longer recognized us. When I finally found my mother, she did not speak at first. She only held me, her arms thin but unyielding, as though she could shield me from everything I had endured. I wanted to tell her of the battles, the friends I had lost, the screams that haunted my nights, but the words died in my throat. I was alive, and that was all she needed to know. Still, survival carried its own burden. I could not celebrate living when so many had not. Their faces followed me, their names etched into my notebook, their voices whispering in my dreams. I was only 15, but I had lived a lifetime inside those weeks. I had survived, yes, but a part of me had remained buried with Warsaw. Though I had survived, the war never left me. My shoulder wound healed in time, but the ache lingered, a dull reminder of the shell that had nearly ended me. Hunger had carved hollows into my body, leaving me frail, my ribs pressing against skin. Yet it was not the body that bore the deepest scars, it was the mind. At night, sleep betrayed me. I would wake to the crack of phantom gunfire, the choking dust of collapsing walls, the cries of children echoing through the ruins. Even silence was no refuge, for in silence I heard the voices of my fallen comrades calling my name, asking why I lived when they did not. I avoided mirrors. In them, I did not see a boy of 15, but someone aged far beyond his years, eyes heavy with things no child should know. My mother tried to comfort me, whispering that I was safe now, but safety felt like an illusion. The war had taught me that nothing could be trusted, not walls, not time, not even tomorrow. The uprising had ended, but inside me the battle raged on, and I knew it always would. If these pages survive me, let them carry more than my fear and sorrow. Let them remind the world what war does to children, to families, to entire cities. I was only 15, and yet I learned how fragile life is, how easily laughter turns to silence, how quickly a friend can vanish into dust. Do not mistake this for heroism. I did not fight because I was brave. I fought because I had no choice, because the streets where I grew up became battlefields, because hunger and oppression left no room for childhood. If I could ask for one thing, it would not be revenge or glory. It would be peace, the simple gift of waking up without the sound of guns, of walking through streets where children can play freely, where mothers do not weep in the shadows. Remember Warsaw. Remember us. For memory is the only victory left to those who endured the firestorm. Now, as I close this notebook, I understand that I am not only writing for myself, I am writing for those whose voices were silenced in the ruins, for the children who never had the chance to grow, for the city that burned yet refused to be forgotten. Warsaw may have fallen, but its spirit endures in every word, every memory, every scar we carry. The world will measure battles by victories and defeats, but I know the truth. The cost of war is not written in borders, but in broken hearts. If someday these pages are read, let them be more than a chronicle of despair. Let them be a warning, a plea, and a remembrance. For history is not only made by generals and treaties, it is carried in the tears of mothers, the courage of children, and the whispers of those who lived through the firestorm. I was only 15, but I would not let Warsaw's memory die.